I think the complexity of the work I take on is far greater. People always think that the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the most complicated. It's so complicated. It's really not. There's a lot of things that are. Iran is complicated. Iran is very, very complicated. And it's also a culture where what you see is, like I said, what you see is not what you get. And people live public lives and private lives, and they're very different. And it takes a long time to figure out the meaning of what people say, much more than what they actually say. And there's so many ethnic groups, so many different factions. So I think the complexity of the projects I take on continues to go up at all times. Whereas, I might have started out doing 10 interviews for something. I think for the Iraqi refugees piece, I did easily 300. So that's what I think it is. And also I feel a far greater level of expectation that people will talk to me. I feel very comfortable going into unknown situations. I think I always have to some extent, but more so. It's just practice. It's like the beginning violinist and the one who does it has done it for 10 years. I mean, there's a difference, right? So I think it's more the quality than the process. Sometimes it's hard to understand, well, I don't know if understand, but certain religious perspectives, not being a religious person. I can understand it, but I'm outside of it, I guess. But at the same time, I think so many people have let me into their worlds despite that. So, for instance, in Iran, I was interested in the extreme, I would say the most religious families, and the ones who were the bazaars, close to the government, pro-Ahmadinejad, certainly, they partly voted him in, and also still venerated Ayatollah Khomeini, even though the fires of the revolution had really gone out in Iran. So I got to know quite well one family. I befriended the daughter who's doing her graduate studies in engineering, got to know them. And they opened their lives to me, and at the same time, when I came to visit them at their house, they said, oh, take your scarf off, don't wear your manto. And this was a family where the 9-year-old girl would run and put on her chador. They don't cover their face, but they cover their hair, when her brother-in-law came over. But with me, none of the rules applied. So they could, differentiate between their own beliefs and what they felt was right, and what they didn't impose them on me, is what I'm trying to say. And so I found people actually more flexible than I expected. So maybe that's answering part of your question. And what was the other part of it?
I guess it's dealing with the challenges of accurately representing information from other cultures. And I guess saying that people really sort of gave you a window into their lives as part of that.
I think to some extent it's cumulative, which is about the time that you spend. I don't feel like I can ever understand a country thoroughly like a native of that place, especially a place as complicated as Iran. It's not possible. But representation is extremely important to me. And so even, say take the Iraqi refugees, it involved, because I did so many interviews, I could start seeing what the general themes are. So that essentially I would choose to write about people whose lives reflected general themes rather than anomalies, even if their stories were very interesting. So in that sense, because I know that what I'm writing may be the only time someone reads about this place, I have a duty to be selective about what I show and make sure that that is an accurate representation, rather than just choosing a really cool story because, it did happen, but is it representative? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand that mentality. You would think that it would be great to have an economist writing because they understand the economy, useful. Whereas anyone who gets into journalism doesn't understand economics. So, but I think, well, yeah, the trouble for my work is it's long-form narrative. Who publishes long-form? The Walrus. I write for the Walrus. Who else? Nobody. That's it. There's just nobody doing it. That's just the way it is. And if one of the frustrating things about writing for Canada is sometimes the mindset's very parochial, like it has to have CanCon. So you have to go to Kurdistan and find somebody that, you know, is in love with Canada or like, I mean, it's just really strains the work that you're doing. So that's why I actually don't write very much here, because there's no space. And there's not a lot of interest. Well, I would say there's interest, but if you give your work away, they'll take it. Yeah, so I'm not interested in that. Yeah, there are advantages and there are disadvantages. I have to say, you know, I don't have a control group, so I only know my own experience, and I can't always pin things down to gender or personality or what have you, circumstance. I think, like I said, you can go into the world of women, and you can go into the world of men, which is an advantage. Whereas men, in a lot of the Middle East, talking to women, it's off limits. When you read about the Middle East, how often do you hear a woman quoted? Very rarely, unless the journalist is a woman. Then you hear women quoted. So I think this is definitely part of it. Also, you know, especially in these conflict zones, women suffer more a lot of the time. They're the ones that have to take care of the babies and that are unable to work. I mean, they're a lot of times the real victims of war. We never hear from them. So that's part of it. The disadvantages, I mean, obviously, there's certain dangers attached to traveling alone, definitely. I had to learn in Iran how to cultivate. I had certain friends of mine who were very reliable and would come with me to interviews, and I wore a wedding ring most of the time, except it was a $12 wedding ring. And especially, there were problems when, see, the women always want to talk about marriage because who they marry determines their future. And so they would always want to look at my ring, and I would tell them it was platinum because I was so embarrassed at the low quality guy that I'd ended up with. And but I would wear a ring, and just so as not to be, I have to deal with the preconceived notions that are out there, and you know, Hollywood spreads this certain view of women, and that's all they really have an idea of. I also had a good friend in Iran who was 6'6" and who had a beard like Ayatollah Khomeini. And so he was from New Zealand, but he looked like Ayatollah Khomeini, which was perfect. And so sometimes I would go out with him. I could take my scarf off in public and no one would bother me in any way. So, but you had to learn a few other tricks. I also, in Iran, it's illegal to shake hands with a man. I would use it as my litmus test. If they shook my hand readily, I knew they were a certain kind of person. They had opened their mind in this way. If they didn't shake my hand, okay, I knew where they stood, but they were direct about it, because they would just be like, no. And if they looked over their shoulder, and then they shook my hand, well, that was a different kind of person as well. They were just checking to see who was watching. So I learned a lot about them through my litmus test, and if they just assumed that I was the Westerner who didn't know that this was the law, so I didn't have any repercussions from that. I also think a lot of people were willing to do interviews with me because they weren't threatened, and maybe there's, like I said, they underestimate women over there, so I couldn't be a spy. I mean, it just wouldn't even occur to them that this was the case, and I think, so in that sense I was perhaps more able to go into areas that would have been too dangerous for a male journalist, in fact.